Good afternoon, and a very warm welcome to everyone joining us today with our special guest, Professor Sarah Soule. My name's Carl Rhodes. I'm a professor of organization studies and the dean here at UTS Business School. Before we begin the proceedings, and on behalf of everyone here, I would like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. It's their ancestral lands that the UTS City campus now stands, and on where I am now, sitting in my office. The Gadigal people have cared for their community, land and waters for thousands of generations based on a deep knowledge of their country. I'd like to pay respects to their ancestors, their elders, and acknowledge their ongoing status as the first peoples of this unceded land. Now, before I introduce our guest, just a few housekeeping items. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be made available as a download soon via the UTS YouTube channel. We will share the link by email to each of you and through the various UTS social media channels by next week. To minimize any technical interruptions and distractions, we've deactivated your cameras and microphones. But I do encourage you to submit questions and comments in the Q&A box in your Zoom control panel, and we'll be asking those questions to Sarah at the end of the presentation. We'll try to get to as many of those questions as we can, and to those people who submitted questions in advance when registering, thank you very much. But now let me introduce our very special guest, Professor Sarah Soule. Sarah is the Morgridge Professor of Organizational Behaviour at Stanford Graduate School of Business. She's the Senior Associate Dean for Academic Affairs and also Professor of Sociology at the School of Humanities and Sciences. Sarah's research focuses on questions at the intersection of organizational theory and social movement theory. This work's been published in leading sociology and management journals, such as the American Journal of Sociology, the Administrative Science Quarterly, and the American Sociological Review. Professor Soule's books include Contention and Corporate Social Responsibility, A Primer on Social Movements, and The Diffusion of Social Movements. Now, we are at a moment in business history where corporations are embracing a rhetoric of public purpose and shareholder capitalism, as well as where certain sections of the political spectrum make vapid claims that woke mobs have taken over the boardrooms of the world's biggest corporations. Now, despite the management fashions of the day, and despite the inflammatory and seditious claims of populist pundits and politicians, there lies a more enduring and profound set of questions concerning the relationship between business, politics, and society. It's such questions, especially as they concern social movements, that Professor Soule has dedicated much of her career and for which she can justifiably claim a long-standing expertise. It's our distinct pleasure to have her with us to address the topic of the relationship between anti-corporate activism and corporate social responsibility. Guests, it gives me great pleasure to welcome Professor Sarah Soule. Over to you, Sarah.
Thank you very much, Dean Rhodes. It's lovely to be here with you all. And I'm delighted to have the chance to share some of the insights from my research and others on the topic that Dean Rhodes so nicely set up for us. So let me begin by just telling you about what my objectives are for our conversation this evening, or this afternoon for you all. I want to talk a little bit about some recent research on the impact of corporate activism on firms. And then I really want to move into sharing some very recent results from a new project that I've been working on the US Black Lives Matter movement in the wake of the killing of George Floyd in 2020. And then I want to talk broadly about some implications of all of this research for corporate activism. So to set the stage for this conversation, I wanted to just begin by noting some of the ways in which people like myself have sort of conceptualized research on corporate activism. And there tends to be about 4 different types of activity that we put in this broad bucket of corporate activism or anti-corporate activism. On one end of the spectrum, there is activism which is taken on by corporations and firms themselves. For example, and this is what I will be talking about a lot tonight, some firms in the US and also in Australia have made broad claims in support of the Black Lives Matter movement or other kinds of social movements and political issues. Other more sort of specific examples might include, for example, in the United States, when the CEO of PayPal decided that there would not be a PayPal office in the state of North Carolina because North Carolina was a state that had passed bans on bathroom bans for around the transgender issue in the US and abroad. So corporations taking some sort of political or social stance. Then we can also think about insider activists. And this typically refers to employee activists in the United States, certainly around some of the controversies supporting around President Trump's immigration bans. Many tech workers targeted their organizations, their leaders, to try to take a stance against some of these controversial immigration reform bills. Intermediate cases tend to refer to individuals who have some partial or perhaps temporary relationship to the organization or the firm. We can think about students who might target their universities around divestment issues, for example. That's been something here at Stanford University that has happened, but certainly it's been historically a tactic of student activists. Another intermediate case might be shareholders in the United States and in other countries who might try to pressure firms through resolutions and through the resolution process. And then finally, we can think about outsider activists. These are people without a connection to, activists without a connection to the firm directly. And so they may boycott broadly a set of firms or a firm for some of their business practices, but they don't have any claim to belonging within or even partially to the organization. Now, we can also think about the kinds of response that we find in this vast literature on how it is that firms might respond to anti-corporate activists. On one end of the spectrum, we have retaliation or repression. In my book, I write about this very fascinating case about the Polaroid Revolutionary Workers Union, who in the 1970s discovered that Polaroid was providing the film that was used in passbooks in the country of South Africa under the system of apartheid. And when the workers discovered this, they were trying to get the company to stop this practice. And what ended up happening was many of the leaders of the Revolutionary Workers Union were fired from Polaroid for their activism. Sometimes corporations deny or ignore that there's been any problem. Generally, the research shows it's not a good idea to do this. Classic example was in the 1990s when Nike was targeted by the Students Against Sweatshops, and they for their labor practices in some of the sweatshops in lesser developed countries. And what we saw was their first approach was to deny that they had any responsibility or culpability for what was going on in the sweatshops. Certainly, there is increasing attention to dialogue and partnerships between firms and those that challenge them. Around the environmental issue, we see a great deal of these kinds of partnerships and discussion. An example in the United States is a grocery store chain, Safeway, that joined Greenpeace in a boycott of Norwegian seafood some years ago now. Sometimes firms make pro-social claims in an attempt to repair the image that might have been harmed by activists who bring negative information up about a company. Sometimes this is positive information that is designed to distract from the issue at hand, which was the case at Walmart, who some years ago faced the largest class action suit by women for a gender gap in pay. And when this happened, it was quite interesting that they announced that they were going to join the solar movement and put solar panels over all of their retail stores. Sometimes firms make symbolic concessions, such as perhaps disclosing in a report what their practices are, as Nike did. Sometimes we see this now, especially with diversity reports, the disclosure of what the figures are for a given firm. Sometimes they put together bodies such as a CSR committee or a diversity committee as well, which might be seen as symbolic in that they haven't conceded completely and given some kind of concrete concession, such as divesting from Burma, as Pepsi did in 1996 after it was targeted by student activists to begin with, and then the Free Burma Coalition. And then also there's this way in which many organizations, and increasingly so, use their foundations to donate funds to various NGOs and even activist groups. We saw this initially in 2014 with the Black Lives Matter movement in the United States, but then, as I'll talk about in just a moment, a large wave of this during the more recent wave of Black Lives Matter protests in the United States. So I want to take us back for a minute to 2020. And I don't know if in Australia there's this phrase, the 2020 was a dumpster fire, but I don't know about you, but it certainly felt like a dumpster fire to me. And we were dealing, of course, with this health crisis and the ambiguity around the pandemic, as well as what looked to be a terrible economic crisis, and then a racial crisis, and as well a political crisis, certainly in the United States, with very acrimonious relationships between our two leading political parties. And one of the things that we learned in the United States during this period, and I should say many people learned this, many people fully understood the inequity in the United States between Black Americans, white Americans, and Latino Americans, our indigenous people, and white Americans. Many people know this. Anybody like myself who has studied sociology knew about the racial disparity in this country. But the pandemic put a light on this for many people who seemed like they were unaware that these kinds of disparities existed. And we saw this with the effect of the pandemic on individuals, which then sort of served as an aperture for people to begin to understand and study what's really been going on in this country. We also saw heightened race-based violence in 2020 and 21. In the United States, there's been an ugly wave of anti-Asian violence, as well as microaggressions in the workplace and general xenophobia, particularly in the wake of the beginning of the pandemic. And then, of course, what also happened in 2020 was the murder of George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, which also shined a light on the sort of ugliness of police brutality in our country against people of color. We also saw during this period waves of very racist and racialized Zoom bombing at schools and businesses, and a general increase in what appeared to be a lot of race-based aggression. And then, of course, what we saw after the murder of George Floyd was the beginning of the Black Lives Matter movement, not the beginning of the movement, but a new wave of the movement. And what we saw was hundreds of protests bringing hundreds of people out into our streets. We also saw that these began to diffuse throughout the world. And in Australia, some pictures from Brisbane and from Melbourne, but you can also see the map to the right of the screen of all of the cities that had protests with more than 500 people. And one of the things that this led us as research to start to think about is this phenomenon that I've used this term in some of my earlier research of osmotic mobilization. And it's this idea that the phenomenon that's going on in our society outside of organizations moves across the boundary and into organizational life. So this could mean that activism on the outside of the organization, such as the Black Lives Matter protests in our streets, finds its way into the organization through employee activism. It also can include CEO activism, which many researchers have noted has been increasing in recent years. And it may also, of course, include shareholder activism. So when we think of this idea of osmotic mobilization, this is really what the projects that I'm about to start telling you about is looking at. This idea of these massive social and political issues in our society finding their way into organizations taking a stance on these kinds of issues in ways that we didn't see before. And so, for example, an example of outsider activism with respect to the 2020-21 period was the massive boycott in 2020 around Juneteenth for Black lives, associated, of course, with the wave of Black Lives Matter protests. We also saw in 2021 a surge in resolutions, shareholder resolutions in the United States, generally around racial equity and diversity. Some 20 companies received resolutions specifically related to racial justice. So, for example, Chevron was the recipient of a shareholder resolution asking for them to disclose all of the ways in which their business practices have hurt people of color in the United States. And then a wave of 69 or more companies, a historic high, asking for disclosure to diversity figures in general. And then there's also been an increasing level of support from investors for these shareholder resolutions. And then we have lots and lots of examples of insider activism, when employees themselves begin to target their organizations for their practices. In some cases, this was because workers wanted to be able to wear Black Lives Matter pins and buttons and t-shirts to work. And other examples, of course, were around other kinds of business practices and so on. But some of the ones that I think were most connected to the Black Lives Matter were around freedom of expression and allowing workers to be able to wear masks and clothing. Okay. The last thing that I wanted to say is, and this is what the focus of the rest of my remarks will be for this talk, is around thinking about corporate activism and the wave of CEOs and corporate leaders releasing statements and making promises to provide resources to either the Black Lives Matter movement directly or generally to do something about systemic racism, racial inequity, racial inequality in our country. This happens to be just an example of Starbucks, but I'm sure you know that, of course, this also happened in Australia. Atlassian is one of my favorite companies that I like to learn about. And sure enough, Atlassian also released a Black Lives Matter statement. So what we want to think about in the remainder of my talk today, and what I want to talk about, are these research findings that, again, I will stress are very much hot off the press. We began this research project during the summer of 2020, when we decided we were going to collect all of these statements, these corporate statements around Black Lives Matter. And we've been following these organizations to find out what it is that they've done. And we've also been spending time conducting some experiments online to understand what the perceptions are of these statements. And then finally, and you'll see this first one here, we've also been looking at how corporate Black Lives Matter statements impact internally some of the discussions that employees are having. So I'll begin with that one. In 2020, in the summer of 2020, we collected these statements, as I said, and we found that 232 of the Fortune 500 companies in the United States issued Black Lives Matter statements. Now, interestingly, of that 232, 104 pledged resources to either the Black Lives Matter movement or generally to eliminate racial injustice, systemic racism. The range in the amount of money was staggering. Some firms pledged, $10,000 US to Black Lives Matter. Others pledged millions and millions of dollars to various organizations, nonprofits, and so on. What we wanted to do first in the first project was take a look at how these statements were viewed by some of the people within these organizations. And I love this particular quote from Dean Rhodes, which is really one of the things that we were so interested in finding out was whether or not some of these, and to what extent these statements were performative. So were statements that didn't provide any concrete resources viewed as more performative? What was the result? What was the effect of that on what it is that employees talk about in their organizations? And so we were really keen to understand this. And so what we decided to look at, to narrow this down, was to look at tech companies in the United States. And one of the first things that we noticed was that when we looked at the timing of Black Lives Matter statements, not surprisingly, in tech, as was the case in the Fortune 500, we see that these happened really within about a month of the killing of George Floyd. Some examples, of course, we have Snapchat, Google, Apple here, but certainly many tech companies did this, as we saw. And interestingly, some of our colleagues at Chicago Booth in the marketing group discovered that there was some backlash when these were perceived to be more performative. Now, what they did essentially was look at the sentiment of tweets following the first and/or second Black Lives Matter statement. And what they discovered was the first statement tended to be fairly performative. Then there was some backlash against that, and then firms would often come back with a more substantial statement offering resources and so on. So this kind of piqued our curiosity. And so what we decided to look at was an anonymous discussion board for tech workers known as Blind. And basically the way Blind works, or Team Blind as it used to be called works, is that if you work at a tech company, you can sign up for an account on Blind. It's just a discussion chat board, and you can talk about anything you want. You are anonymized, except for you are identified by the company at which you work. So I might be employee XXX at netflix.com or something like that. And so we are able to figure out what company somebody lives in and works in, but we have no idea who they are. And one of the things that is distressing generally is that when we begin to use a natural language processing algorithm to look at the comments that are on Blind generally, there's a lot of derogatory posts just generally that we see. So that's the first thing that's maybe not surprising, but certainly distressing. We did a sample here of 25 US tech companies. So one of the things that we noticed was that there were surges in anti-Black language, anti-Black derogatory comments. These are just 3 random tech companies from the 25. And what you see is in June, after the killing of George Floyd, and when these statements were released by their leaders, you see massive peaks in what people are saying in negative language about Black Americans. And so one of the things that we also noticed here is the first thing is if we looked at a focal company, what we saw is that the peak was after the release of a pro-BLM statement by the leader. And so what seems to be happening is that this is triggering people to go onto the discussion board and say nasty, derogatory things. What was interesting to us is then we looked at how performative the statement was, and the findings were much larger. So this is consistent with that Twitter study that I showed you earlier, that performativity in these statements kind of does exactly as Dean Rhodes has talked about, has this sort of negative backlash effect, more so than a more substantive promise of donations and promise of real resources. Now, the next thing we did with this is, and as an organizational sociologist, I was really interested in finding out, well, maybe there's something, maybe some of these tech companies have a different kind of culture, and maybe that culture has a way in which it can make that kind of behavior less likely to happen. And my colleague, Charles O'Reilly, defines culture as a set of norms and values that are widely shared and strongly held throughout the organization. And he talks very much about the ways in which the values that we hold lead into the norms around our behaviors, and that what we really see are the behaviors. And when we think about this, and when we think about how Charles talks about culture, the most obvious thing that we think about are what are those beliefs and values? But we also need to think about the intensity, about how strongly people believe in those, and also whether or not people agree that those are the right values. So one of the things that we wanted to have a look at was this question of maybe organizational culture at these 25 tech companies might have some influence on the behavior of these people who are going on to the blind chat and discussing whatever it is that they're discussing. But maybe in what we were hypothesizing was that maybe more positive, diversity-friendly cultures dampen that kind of behavior. That was our hope. And we thought this because what Charles and others in the organizational culture world tell us is that culture can serve as a system of control when it's very, very strong. That is, when there's a lot of consensus around the values that are important and that people believe them intensely, then they're less likely to deviate from the norms. So in a sense, strong cultures can control our behaviors. But on the flip side, it could also be that strong cultures can also draw people who fit that culture to the organization. And so maybe it's the case that more pro-diversity cultures draw in people who are less likely to go on an anonymous discussion forum and say derogatory things about people of color. So this is what we wanted to look at. And it turned out that a group at MIT has come up with a really interesting way of measuring organizational culture by using artificial intelligence and natural language processing to analyze the text response on reviews from reviews by actual employees. So for example, if I'm a Netflix employee and I go on to the platform Glassdoor and I can review my company and say what it's like to work there, talk about the culture, I can talk about salary, I can talk about whatever it is that I want to talk about. And some people think, oh, well, Glassdoor must just be a bunch of complainers. In fact, the folks at MIT have discerned that that's actually not the case. Only 10% of the reviews on Glassdoor are complainers. The rest are folks just talking about their salary and talking about the culture and what's good and bad about working there. And so one of the distinct values that the MIT folks have coded for is the diversity value, which includes such things as the company promoting a diverse and inclusive workplace, including people from underrepresented backgrounds into the organization, and so on, and celebrating folks. So what we did, and they generously shared the data with us so we could look at our tech firms, our 25 tech firms. And the thing that we found, which is really fascinating and certainly in support of what Charles would argue about the way in which culture, organizational culture, can help to control our behavior, is that when we look at the growth or the increase in this derogatory language on Team Blind, people saying terrible things on this discussion platform, what we see is that the higher it is that the companies with the higher values on this diversity score are much less likely to have increases in this derogatory language usage. Now, again, it could be like, as I said, that culture is controlling people, or it could be that organizations that have more pro-diversity cultures draw people to them who are less likely to go say terrible things on Team Blind and other platforms. So a couple of just provisional findings here. The first is just generally there is this kind of the disturbing trend in derogatory language on these anonymous platforms, maybe not surprising. The one thing that I think I neglected to mention is we haven't used these data yet, but we also saw that with the start of the pandemic, anti-Asian language was detected first using our algorithm. Then later, after 2020, we see the rise of anti-Black language. And it gets worse, at least at our tech companies, following a performative Black Lives Matter statement. Okay. So I'm going to talk very quickly in the last about 15 minutes that I have of your attention, or 10 or 15 minutes, about two other parts of this project. And then we'll open it up for some questions and answers, and I'm delighted to hear your feedback. Now, the second project that we wanted to look at was the extent to which these Black Lives Matter statements by companies had any effect on mobilizing support for a campaign that the company might be undertaking in support of the movement. And so, as I mentioned before, we collected these data on from the Fortune 500, 232 of which issued these supportive Black Lives Matter statements. Now, I mentioned this before, but about 104 of those pledged resources, money, donations to either Black Lives Matter or generally to either nonprofits or to their own organizations to attempt to eliminate racial injustice and systemic racism. So what we were wondering is, how are these statements viewed by people outside of these organizations? Remember, the first study was really about people inside the organization and what kinds of things they say on these platforms. And what we know, of course, and certainly many of us have read about this phenomenon, is that in the impression management literature, there's this general assumption and finding that organizations try to communicate positive attributes about themselves, right? So, for example, you may have recalled that Marks and Spencer fell under criticism because of the packaging in the month of June during LGBTQ plus plus month and so on, that they decided that they would brand their sandwiches in sort of rainbow colors and so on, and they were criticized for this behavior. So in routine management, we may think of woke washing and greenwashing. In the case of scandals, you often see excuses, justifications, apologies, and denials. Well, one of the things that we discovered when we read all of these statements that the Fortune 500 were making was that companies were voluntarily communicating negative things about themselves. So again, usually in the impression management literature, the companies will say something very positive about themselves, perhaps to distract from something negative they've done, or perhaps just to try to make themselves look like good corporate actors. And what we noticed was that some of these acknowledged some lack of knowledge or awareness about racial inequity. And so we sort of think of these as confessions of omission of sins. Sins of omission. And then some of them actually gave some kind of a confession about something that they've done, a business practice that has been suboptimal with respect to race. And so what we found was about 82 of those 232 statements seem to have some element of confession, either because they've committed a sin or because something they have failed to do is confessed. And so a couple of examples of this, just to get your mind around them, is when we see these cases of confessions around omission. Essentially, they claim that they don't know anything, and they didn't understand racism, and they usually promise that they're going to go on some learning journey as a result. And you can see, I won't read this, but you can see on the screen an example of this. We didn't have the lived experience or the knowledge to know about racism, but wow, now we're going to learn. When we think about these confessions around something that they've committed, they admit to something that they've done. And in this particular case, the company is saying that, yes, organizations and businesses, including us, have been complacent and complicit. We've failed, and so on. So we were really interested in this phenomenon of confession, because it is really different than what we think of when we think of impression management as this positive way in which organizations try to make themselves out to be better than they are. So we had a look at these statements, as I said, and we coded them. And then we ran an online experiment on the platform Prolific, where we just simply randomly presented one of these Black Lives Matter statements to about 1,000 subjects. And we asked them, will you donate $1 to the Black Lives Matter movement? And will you write a letter of support for the Black Lives Matter movement? And interestingly, what we found is that both types of confession, as opposed to no confession at all, that was the other category of these, increase the subject's willingness to first support for the firm, but then also for Black Lives Matter. So firms that confessed were rated more highly on dimensions of corporate social responsibility than those that didn't confess. But then the subjects who saw confession statements that were more likely to both donate money to the Black Lives Matter movement and also write a letter. And then we coded the length of the letter. We actually had them write the letter. So we haven't analyzed this yet, but we also know what they wrote, but we also know the length. And importantly, these confessions of commission were more powerful than the omission types. And I think, and I don't know, this is hot off the press, but I think that the kinds of confessions of omissions are perceived of as more performative, just like as we saw in the first study, that these Black Lives Matter statements that did not promise resources were seen as much more performative. Again, very provisional findings, but I'm very happy to share them with you. Okay, one more study to share, and then I'll conclude with a few general remarks about what I think some of the implications are for this work, and then we'll open it up for questions and answers. Okay, the final study that we've done is looking at the effects of perceived hypocrisy on mobilizing support. And in particular, as you'll see, what we've done is, some of you may have heard or read about the fact that Walmart came under fire during the 2020 protests and their Black Lives Matter statement, because the CEO did issue a very powerful statement. However, it was later discovered that Walmart was selling all Lives Matter T-shirts, and so there were many critics and more protests against Walmart as a result of this hypocrisy. So we wanted to do something with this idea of hypocrisy, and so what we did is we did two things for this. We first decided that we needed to collect the same statements that we collected on the Fortune 500, the Black Lives Matter statements, from benefit corporations or B Corps in the United States. So using the B Lab list of 1,300 plus B corporations, we found that about 293 of those had released a Black Lives Matter statement. So interestingly, if you look at the percentages here, B Corps, at least in the May to July period, were less likely to release a Black Lives Matter statement than were Fortune 500. That alone is interesting. I'm not sure why. Some of our interviews with leaders of B Corps suggested that if you think about it, many of the B Corps are very, very small, two, 3, 4, 5 people in the organization. So this is probably skewed by size, and it may also be skewed by the fact that perhaps there's an assumption that as a B Corp, of course, they would be in support of Black Lives Matter. We're not sure what's going on there. So what we wanted to know was, though, if we could look at selling, after making a statement, selling Black Lives Matter T-shirts, how might that be perceived of by external people, by subjects? And is there a difference between benefit corps and B Corps and Fortune 500? So what we did was we did another online experiment, this one a little smaller, 584 people. And we showed a fictitious Black Lives Matter statement by an organization called Supermarket. And some of the subjects were told that that Supermarket was a Fortune 500 company, while others were told that it was a B Corp. And then some were additionally told that Supermarket has been selling All Lives Matter T-shirts. And so then we asked if they would support the BLM campaign sponsored by Supermarket, and would they give some donations to this, and would they write letters? And so what we found, and I think the most important thing to focus on here, is that the subjects donated more money to B Corps in the All Lives Matter condition. So when a B Corp makes a Black Lives Matter statement and sells a T-shirt, they still get donations, and the length of the letter written is much longer compared to the Fortune 500 doing the same thing. So it's as if there's something about the B Corp organizational form which buffers it against this criticism, and they're given more license, shall you say. Or stated differently, perhaps it's the case that people are more suspicious generally of the Fortune 500 when they're engaging in these kinds of activist kinds of campaigns. So again, when B Corps engage in this hypocritical activity, their campaigns for BLM are still supported, and this was not the case for the Fortune 500. So got kind of another interesting finding here to chew on. So a couple of implications of all of this before we pause for questions and answers. And I thank you all for your patience as I've gone through kind of a lot of studies very quickly here. The first thing that I wanted to mention is that as part of this project, we decided we would do a survey and ask the question of how much do you support corporate activism, CEOs engaging in political activity, in social activism, and so on. And what I'll draw your attention to is if we look at the end of the scale with agree and strongly agree, 6 and 7, or even with the fifth number 5 here, which is somewhat agree, people generally support corporate activism. Now, we've also done a lot of interviews over the course of 2021 and 2022, and those interviews are showing that not only do people support corporate activism, they're coming to expect it. And what I think this poses is a paradox for corporate leaders. And what do I mean by that? What I mean is that Black Lives Matter statements in tech companies may have led to employee backlash if we're right about what we saw on this Team Blind platform, and that these are, this is especially the case when these statements are more performative. And then I mentioned the corporate culture effect here that kinds of influences this. But silence isn't an option, right? So this may lead you to say, clearly, as a corporate leader, I shouldn't engage in this kind of activism, and I certainly shouldn't engage in performative activism. But silence isn't an option. You must do something. And so with that, one possibility is, and again, this is for the Black Lives Matter movement only, and we'll see, we're starting to do some experiments in other different types of movements to see if the power of confession is there as well. So perhaps it's the case that confession, and especially confessing sins of commission, may be a new impression management tactic that can work and can avoid the tactic of the criticism of performativity. And so companies, I guess, generally need to be very careful, obviously, about perceptions of hypocrisy and performativity, but also recognizing that silence really is no longer an option in the social and political realm. Okay, so with that, thank you again for your patience, and I will take questions and answers, and thanks for listening.
Look, on behalf of everyone, thanks so much, Sarah. I'll kind of moderate the questions and maybe throw in a few myself as well. As you were talking, I was thinking particularly about when, in some sense, corporations are a microcosm of society, and you're kind of getting to the end that corporations have to respond now. And I was thinking then about the NFL and the saga with Colin Kaepernick, where he was condemned widely for taking the knee for protesting police violence, cheered on gleefully by Donald Trump. That's the NFL, not Colin Kaepernick. And then they kind of did a big U-turn not long after that. Is it that there are strong social pressures that corporations now feel they have to respond to? So, I mean, are the agents society that corporations are responding to, or do you think corporations are actually the agents of change themselves?
Oh, so this is a really terrific question. And the Kaepernick example is a really, really good one. Somebody who goes from being vilified to becoming the spokesperson for Nike, and somebody who becomes one of the leading people who is looked to for advice on what companies should do, and again, not just Nike, but others. And I think, and here's what I think, and this may be based on the United States and the United States phenomenon, but I would bet that this would be the case in other countries as well. And that is that increasingly the public doesn't trust the government. There's a lot of political polarization. I'm stating the obvious now, obviously, and that there's a lot of gridlock, and the governmental sector is less able to make the changes that once they could. So in my book, which interestingly was now written, in 2009, I make the point that when one point of access feels closed, activists target another. And so one of the points that I was making in the book is that to the extent that the US government or state level government or county level government is closed or unable to respond, then smart activists will target additional points. And in this case, and I think what has been happening is they've turned to companies. Now, at the same time, there's been this interesting phenomenon amongst companies that CEOs have become both more activist, more outspoken. People expect this behavior. And there's a sense in which, quiet CEOs of yesteryear are gone. CEOs are writing blogs on LinkedIn and becoming much more public figures. I think that there have been some studies that people are more likely to recognize some of the famous CEOs, at least in the United States, than they are politicians. And so that's a long way of saying I believe that it now is expected, yes, and that many company leaders, not just CEOs, are seeing this as their call to action, and that they do want to make change, and they're recognizing the extraordinary power that they have and the responsibility that they have. And in the United States, with a fractured political system, I think we can all hope that these will be, they will rise to this occasion and make change for good.
Thank you very much. I'm going to turn now to a question that's just been asked by Peter McNamara, where he says, "Hi, Sarah. Do you think corporate activism has taken a backward step during COVID-19? Where the social values they have expressed for BLM or marriage equality have not been the same in response to the pandemic? For example, comments against lockdowns or public health measures which impact bottom line more directly."
That's a really very interesting question. And particularly on things such as like vaccine mandates, right? Companies have been quiet about that, or at least quieter about that. Not all of them. I will sort of say that some notable companies in the United States, some of the airlines, for example, took very strong stances on vaccine mandates and not just expecting their workers to, but doing things like saying, if you don't get a vaccine, then we're going to charge you a lot more for your health insurance, since you're likely going to get sick, and we're going to have to bear the costs of that. And so I think some companies did do that. What I'm interested in digging into a little bit more with this question, Peter, which is a terrific question, is what's happening now? And so one piece of our research is following up not only on, so let's follow the money, let's follow these promises. Have companies actually disperse these large sums of money that they promise? So we're in the middle of kind of tracking that. But then also, does releasing a Black Lives Matter statement make you more likely to, let's say, make statements and make claims about climate change, or about what other big issues tend to be on the agenda for activists now? And so we'll sort of see.
Thanks. Now, there's two questions here that are related, and they are a little bit outside of the precise object of your study, but this is about what things are like outside of the United States and outside of multinational corporations. Mahavir Singh Peshi says corporate activism works better in developing countries than developed countries, i.e. Latin America versus North America and Europe. While Taiwan asks, how about in Asia? Is it as energized in the West? Do you have a sense globally? Is this how this works?
This is a great question. And here's my hypothesis. And I'm clear, I want to be clear, it's a hypothesis. What I would predict is that corporate activism, both in terms of a phenomenon and in terms of perhaps its success and the outcomes, depends a lot on how well functioning the polity is. And I want to say two things about that. One, we generally, and we know this, have seen less activism in less democratic or more authoritarian nations. This is a sort of a historical phenomenon because we're often likely to see higher levels of repression, activism in general. So we'll first sort of, say that. And then the second thing I'll say is in, democratic countries with ill-functioning polities, I think we're probably much more likely to see a different point for activists to try to target. It's a different opportunity structure, and I think the hope would be, the hope of the activists would certainly be that this will produce more benefits, since the polity is not working as we would hope it would. That's a hypothesis, testable. Maybe I'll get another new PhD student who wants to work on that one with me. But great questions.
Yeah, yes, that would be a great study. There's a short question here from a person who remains anonymous, who asks, how do you think the future role of corporate boards might change as a result of your findings? What does this mean more generally for corporate governance? I know you did mention shareholder activists before too.
Yes. So a couple of thoughts on that, and one thought on that certainly is that when we talk about some of the activism directed at companies around issues of internal diversity. So, we want you to release your diversity figures. We want you to do something about the culture of the organization around diversity, equity, and inclusion. A lot of the activism is also pointed to the lack of board diversity in many countries that don't have requirements for diversity on the board, on boards. And so one possibility is, well, gee, to the extent that some of this activism may lead to changes in the board structure and add more diversity to boards, that's one sort of piece of this which might, I think, be important. The other thing that I think might see is, typically, and I've studied shareholder resolutions in the US for a number of years now, and the typical thing that we find is that there are a lot of ESG related corporate shareholder resolutions, but of course none of them go to a vote, or very few go to a vote, and if they do go to a vote, they don't pass. And so that itself is a sort of performative exercise. It does draw some, they tend to draw some attention, of course, media attention, and that can be an indirect effect. But where I'm going with this, at least with respect to this last year, what we saw was that there was, yes, an increase in the kinds of shareholder resolutions around diversity issues, racial issues, and so on, but a lot more shareholder energy around them, and a lot more, sort of support for these. So to the extent that this re-engages, again, at least in the US, re-engages shareholders in this process, this could have profound effects on corporate governance.
And I'll ask you a final question. This one comes from Bronwyn Dalton, the answer to which might be particularly instructive to me, actually, where Bronwyn asks, what role can business schools play to support corporate activism? Should we move away from more CSR-focused teaching to examining the role or agency within civil society? What types of subjects could increase awareness of these dynamics for students? Yes.
Oh, Bronwyn, I love this question. And part of the reason I love this question is that this is exactly what we've been talking about certainly at Stanford, and I bet you all are talking about this too. And that is, and I think there are pressures from a few places. First, our students, as I bet your students, are craving the kind of education that you're talking about. It's not that they dislike work on corporate social responsibility, but they want to know how they can change organizations, but also how, when they are leading organizations, they can lead broader societal change. They really want to know this. And So that's one piece of this. And the second piece of this that I think is really interesting and profound, and something that we're talking a lot about, is how can we bring our faculty, our teaching faculty and our research faculty to the table to begin to take up that challenge that the students are asking for, and certainly the broader environment is asking for it. In fact, our alums are asking for this too, both in terms of the research that we do and in terms of the curriculum that we offer, the case studies that we write, and what we bring into the classroom. Because I think, Bronwyn, this is probably where your question was going, I think that business schools must rise to the occasion so that we can train the next generation of leaders to be ethical leaders who can make decisions that are beneficial to the society at large, because this is not only what the students want to do, but I think it's going to be incredibly important for companies to take up this challenge. So I hope in 2 years from now, those of us who are on the leadership team at the Stanford Graduate School of Business might have some offerings, and I'm certain that under Dean Rhodes, you probably will also have some terrific offerings.
Look, thank you so much, Sarah. That was really illuminating, insightful, and fascinating presentation. That's really put an important yet different kind of level of depth of understanding to the kinds of things we've been observing. So very much on behalf of the many UTS and Stanford Australia Foundation people who are attending today, a very sincere thank you for taking your time this afternoon for us, and this evening for you.
Thank you very much for having me.
Most welcome. There was another question that said, will the slides be available? The whole presentation will be available next week through the UTS YouTube channel, and you will be informed of that as well if you registered on the registered for today. Everybody, we do need to draw to a close the webinar today. We have more UTS Business School Stanford Australia events throughout the year. I do hope you will join us for those events. We have some other upcoming webinars from the school, including a panel discussion on the Health and Aging Collaborative Research Project that we're doing, amongst other things. For more details and to register, please go to the UTS Business School's website and click on events. But for now, thank you again to our special guest, Professor Sarah Soule, for the tremendous insight, recommendation, and knowledge for today's webinar, and for a very broad and indeed generous presentation of her new work. To our audience, thank you for your time. We look forward to hosting you again at UTS. I say this every time on webinars, ideally in person the next time. On behalf of UTS Business School, thank you and goodbye.